Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a sudden and massive policy shift, one that is literally sending shockwaves through the entire North American economy. In a move that honestly stunned a lot of supply chain experts and market watchers, the administration intends to completely abandon the renewal of the USMCA. That's the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. So we're going to look closely at exactly why the president is risking the stability of this massive trilateral trade deal, the core arguments driving this decision, and of course the real-world ripple effects this could have on your everyday life.
To really get why this is happening, we have to start right at the source. Just recently, President Trump made his stance on the future of this agreement incredibly clear. He stated, quote, "We don't need anything that Canada has. We don't need anything that Mexico has, but they need everything that we have," end quote. Now that right there is the inciting incident for our entire analysis today. It's a bold, totally zero-sum view of North American trade, and it really sets the stage for what critics are calling a high-stakes gamble with our closest neighbors.
But, we have to contrast that rhetoric with the hard economic reality. $900 billion. Because despite the assertion that the U.S. doesn't need anything from its neighbors, in 2024 alone, the United States imported more than $900 billion in goods from Mexico and Canada combined. The economic stakes here are just astronomical. We're talking about deeply, deeply intertwined supply chains that serve as the absolute backbone for countless industries across the continent.
So, to make sense of all this, here is our roadmap for today. First, ditching the trade deal. Second, why target the USMCA? Third, the cost of uncertainty. And finally, the political divide.
All right, part one, ditching the trade deal, calling a mulligan on NAFTA 3.0.
So remember, the USMCA was widely touted as the signature trade achievement of the administration's first term. Under those original terms, it actually provided long-term certainty, locking in trade rules all the way until July 2036. But now, the president has indicated he wants to renegotiate every single year. Just imagine trying to build a multi-million-dollar factory or plan a complex cross-border supply chain when the fundamental rules of trade could be upended every 12 months. That massive shift from long-term stability to an unpredictable yearly cycle is a huge structural change.
Moving into part two, why target the USMCA? Deficits, transshipments, and group chats.
Let's break down the White House's rationale step by step. First off, they're placing a heavy amount of blame on the USMCA for worsening U.S. trade deficits with both Mexico and Canada. They view these deficits as fundamentally disadvantageous to the U.S. Second, and this is a really big one, they argue that foreign powers, specifically China, are using our neighbors to circumvent U.S. tariffs. And third, fundamentally, this administration just has a strong documented preference for bilateral, one-on-one deals rather than dealing with multiple countries at once. So let's talk about that second point, which we can call the transshipment loophole. Basically, here's how the administration argues it works. Automobile parts are manufactured over in China, but instead of shipping them directly to the US and getting hit with heavy tariffs, they get shipped to Mexico. Down there, they're integrated into larger assemblies and then shipped right across the border into the United States under the duty-free protections of the USMCA. The administration argues this loophole allows Chinese manufacturing to completely skirt U.S. tariffs, and it is a primary reason they want to tear the current deal down. And then there's the underlying philosophy of it all. It's essentially a battle between bilateral and trilateral deals, or, as some observers have cleverly put it, the president really doesn't like group chats on the global stage. The White House vastly prefers one-on-one negotiations. In that setting, the United States can maximize its immense economic leverage against a single opponent, rather than having to make concessions or compromise within a multi-nation framework like the USMCA.
Okay, part three, the cost of uncertainty. From abstract policy right down to the kitchen table.
The absolute crux of the issue here is economic uncertainty. We're talking about the unpredictable environment created when trade rules are constantly up for renegotiation. Because whether you agree with the president's hardline tactics or not, economists across the board pretty much agree that unpredictability is terrible for business. When companies can't plan their supply chains or accurately forecast their costs, that friction inevitably trickles down through the broader economy.
And this uncertainty actually manifests in the stuff you buy every single week. A huge majority of our winter fruits and vegetables, they come straight across the southern border from Mexico. Up north, Canada supplies massive amounts of lumber, which directly impacts housing construction costs and, by extension, home prices. And as we just discussed with that transshipment issue, the auto industry relies heavily on parts manufactured in Mexico that are later assembled in the USA. If trade with these countries stalls or if new tariffs are slapped on, critics are warning we'll see immediate price spikes in groceries, housing, and vehicles.
Which leads us to a really stark warning from critics. For everyday families who are already struggling to afford basic goods, injecting chaos into these established supply chains could severely exacerbate inflation. Some lawmakers are even calling it adding insult to economic injury for a tariff-ravaged economy.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 4, the political divide, border states and centrist pushback. If you look geographically, the states with the absolute highest reliance on the USMCA are our border states. We're talking about places like Washington and Michigan relying heavily on Canada, while Arizona and California are deeply tied to Mexico. And notice that many of these are blue states, which is setting up a really fierce political battle. Agricultural products flowing out of the middle of America, heading up north and down south, are incredibly vulnerable if these long-standing trade corridors are disrupted.
And we're already seeing lawmakers from these exact states sounding the alarm. Take Representative Susan DelBene, for example, who stated quite clearly, quote, "Washington has particularly benefited from this agreement. Withdrawing will harm our already tariff-ravaged economy and threaten jobs." End quote. This really represents a broader centrist and regional pushback from leaders who recognize their local economies are simply too intertwined with Mexico and Canada to just walk away without massive economic casualties.
So as we pull all of this together, there's actually a weird sort of consensus. Pretty much everyone agrees that ditching the USMCA creates unprecedented uncertainty. The real divide is in how they view that uncertainty. On one side, White House supporters view it as a master negotiating tactic, a way to keep opponents off balance, to leverage better America First terms. But on the other side, critics argue that this exact uncertainty is what causes runaway inflation, spikes grocery prices, and permanently damages the long-term business supply chains that take literally decades to build.
Which leaves us with this final, pivotal question to think about. Is constant renegotiation a master negotiating tactic, or is it a permanent disruption to the American economy? The administration is betting big that short-term chaos will yield long-term gains. Meanwhile, critics fear the ripple effects of this gamble are going to be felt at every single kitchen table in America for years to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this